Hey there! Long time no speak. It's been a while since I uploaded a video. Not that long, but certainly longer than I have up until this point. To anybody who was remotely concerned, don't you worry. The delay in uploading videos is in no part related to anything negative. It's actually been a really wonderful and exciting time for me, but with that came a lot of stuff to do that wasn't specifically making videos. I imagine that isn't a terribly uncommon state given that spring is rolling around for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. And in fact, part of this excitement has sort of inspired today's topic, which is the witch's relationship with sleep. Now, aspects of this topic, of course, come up fairly regularly in certain corners of magical, spiritual, or mystical practices. And I think for a lot of us, it's sort of a topic that kind of hovers in the background, but which we don't necessarily spend a ton of time really considering in any sort of depth. Certainly within my own practice, I've become more and less intimate with certain aspects of sleep and certain kinds of workings associated with sleep. But at least in my case, this has taken 2 or 3 particular forms and has been more practical than spiritual in nature, insofar as it's been driven by an interest in a particular sort of skill rather than directly related to the more spiritual end of my practice. And yet I think most spiritual folk, and witches in particular, would agree that sleep is one of the great mysteries. We spend a third of our life asleep. The strange states that we enter while sleeping are well documented and remain nevertheless quite poorly understood from a scientific standpoint. And yet, although many witches will at some point explore a couple of aspects of the process of sleeping, particularly as they relate to mental state, I can't help but feel that this is a topic, an area that gets fairly short shrift, which many of us might benefit from exploring a little more fully. Now, I feel like it's important to state here that I definitely don't consider myself an expert in this area, either scientifically or from the standpoint of my practice. And my focus on it today is very much a byproduct of the fact that I've suddenly found myself shoved in the direction of being very much engaged on the spiritual end during sleep and dreaming, which is not something that I've really done before. What I'm going to be discussing, therefore, are simply things that have occurred to me over the past few weeks since I've found myself sort of dumped onto this turf with which I am not particularly familiar. Now, when I think about witchy or New Age approaches to sleep, I think of 3 particular things, which I have engaged with to a greater or lesser extent in the past. Those 3 things that I think about are dream journaling, lucid dreaming, and dream interpretation. Now, these by no means are the exclusive domain of pagans or spiritualists. Dream interpretation, for instance, really found its major popularization, if not its genesis, within psychoanalytic theory. To a lot of people who aren't necessarily particularly spiritual or in touch with any sort of spiritual community, when you say the words dream interpretation, they think Freud, they think Carl Jung. And of course, some of them will reach further back in history and think of dream propheticism, because I think to a decent chunk of people, the concept of dream interpretation is really entwined with the concept of oracles and prophecy derived from altered mental states. And I think that this association is still very much reflected in a lot of popular representations of prophecy. For instance, we've all no doubt seen the scene in television shows or movies where somebody with the sight or some facility with prophecy is forcibly shoved into an altered state. experiences something very much like what from an external viewpoint looks like a drug-induced psychotic episode, dissociation or hallucination, or the experience of passing out in exhaustion and being consumed by this altered state of reality, this different world. Now, of these major versions of interaction with the concept of sleep that I've mentioned, dream analysis is by far the one I've engaged in least. And I think to a certain extent that reflects the fact that it is simplified in many texts to the point of uselessness. By which I mean a lot of witchy texts that do touch on this topic and which were my only point of interaction with this topic for a very long time, cover it at such a superficial level that it's incredibly easy to dismiss entirely. The concepts of archetypal symbology and particularly their interaction with personal experience that results in its own symbology are rarely covered. And instead, you're liable to get a list of different objects and definitions for each of those things, when in reality, that is a level of simplification that I think, is hard to swallow for a lot of people, because it is clear that that doesn't even scratch the surface of what you're looking at when you experience dreams. Now, on that score, my ignorance is clearly my own fault, because there are texts that deal with the concept of dream interpretation in incredible detail. And as I mentioned before, there is a huge chunk of psychoanalytic theory that is based very much in this concept and has spent a lot of time exploring this concept of dream interpretation. Now, dream journals. This is something that I did for a very long time. And from a practical standpoint, dream journaling does have an incredibly valuable use. Many people have said it, and it has been my own personal experience that, yes, when you get into the habit of journaling your dreams, you remember most of them. From a purely hedonistic standpoint, remembering one's dreams consistently is quite a lot of fun. Dreams tend to be very interesting, and for my part, I have always found my dreams to be adventurous and well-plotted stories that I wanted very much to retain as a means of getting something out of the 8 hours a day, roughly, I spent asleep. And this desire has persisted independent of any other advantage or spiritual benefit. Apart from dream recall, the other widely touted advantage of dream journaling is that it does facilitate lucid dreaming. And this facilitation, I suspect, is a byproduct of being more aware and conscious of the process of dreaming, the patterns that emerge in one's dreams, which in turn facilitate recognizing that one is in a dream state. Now, I think lucid dreaming is something that, by and large, a lot of people who engage in the sorts of spiritual practices that I do are familiar with as a concept. But I have heard from time to time people mistake lucid dreaming for merely having very vivid dreams, which is not what I mean when I say lucid dreaming. What I'm talking about is the phenomenon of becoming aware that one is asleep and within a dream while they are dreaming, which in turn grants one the capacity to manipulate that dream. I think that lucid dreaming has considerable potential from a spiritual and spellcrafting standpoint. Now, there are loads of resources that discuss how one can train oneself to become more adept at entering a lucid state in dreaming. There are lots of tips and tricks, so I won't go into any detailed discussion of how one pulls this off, except to add one recommendation that I don't typically see, which is a slight modification of the waking approach, which is setting an alarm to wake yourself up during the course of the night so that you can fall asleep again, with the idea being that if you manage to wake yourself during a dream state while avoiding pulling yourself too far out of that state that you can't slip back into it, it makes it quite easy to sort of pick up where you left off, but now aware of the fact that you're slipping back into REM. Now, the suggestion that I wanted to offer when one is attempting to do that is 1, the relative ratio of REM sleep increases as sleep time increases, which is to say, give yourself a few hours after falling asleep before you start the sleep-wake pattern. Although, of course, you want to make sure that it's not so many hours that when you wake up, you're relatively well rested and disinclined to fall asleep again. And 2, ideally, I think it's preferable to be woken by something that is not intensely jarring. You don't want to elicit an, oh shit, I slept in, oh crap, I need to be up and aware response. Rather, you want to be pulled as gently as possible out of sleep so that you can slip peacefully back into it, which means that anything that involves you doing something while awake is inherently counterproductive. Now, most alarms, of course, require you to turn them off to shut them up. If you're using your iPhone, for instance, and you set an alarm, that thing's going to be going for 15 minutes. Now, there are apps you can download that allow you to set alarms that only play for a short period of time. Alternately, you can record an audio file, an audio track that is 8 or 9 hours long and mostly silence, but that has a few 15 or 20-second alarm sounds that play at particular intervals, and which therefore will play for a little bit of time and then turn themselves off without requiring any intervention on your part. As far as the alarm sound goes, something melodic that is distinctly not the usual bumps and groans of your settling house may be ideal. The gentler, the better, although of course you do want it to be intrusive enough to actually pull you from sleep, but conversely not something so irritating that it will keep you from falling asleep, nor anything too similar to the sort of thing that you would ordinarily use as a get your ass out of bed sort of alarm. And in terms of the pattern of play, in general, you're probably looking to have that first waking event occur at 4-ish hours after falling asleep. And you can have a second and a third one playing at 30-minute intervals, say. Finally, keep in mind that as you practice this, it may be advantageous to change what that specific wake-up chime, melody, whatever is from week to week, because as your brain associates it with this is not a force me out of bed sound, you may habituate to it and begin sleeping through it. So if you find that you start not waking in response, changing the nature of that sound will once again help you to actually rouse at that 4.5, 5-hour point. How long those melodies play at each of those intervals is going to be up to you. I'm somebody who does not sleep through anything like an alarm or a waking melody. It'll get me up in about 5 or 10 seconds. Therefore, 15 to 20 seconds is ample time. If you're somebody who uses something like a radio alarm clock, although I don't even know if people still use these, but anyway, if you're somebody who wakes themselves with music and you frequently sleep through the first 1 or 2 songs, you may need something longer. And in that case, you might want to avoid anything that's overly melodic, since your mind associates it with transitioning rapidly to a fully waking state. Now, this is the point at which, in my experience, most discussions of the spiritual nature of sleep end. There is, however, I think, a great deal more that can be explored. As with one's waking practice, sleep can be ritualized and can incorporate many of the same components that we use when crafting ritual experiences for ourselves in circle or during our waking life. For instance, the use of scents and gustatory experience in the form of herb-filled pillows or sachets or incenses or teas are things we can use immediately prior to or as we fall asleep. And although that's hardly a new idea, I've found that often the same scents and teas come up again and again, and the focus is almost always about increasing recall of dreams or enhancing lucidity of dreams. But as I mentioned in my olfactory videos, I think there are a couple now, once we've built an association between a particular scent and a concept or desire or experience, we can use those scents as cues to facilitate our engagement with those concepts or goals as we enter the dream state or as we enter sleep. Which means if you have built an association between a particular scent and a specific aspect of shadow work during ritual, you can then employ that scent as you fall asleep with the express purpose of engaging with that shadow as you slumber. You can also extend the level of ritualization involved in that transition by turning the process of getting ready for bed, setting up your sleeping space, and falling asleep into the opening part of your ritual with the intention of shaping your sleep that night into something outside of the ordinary or designed to focus on a particular concept or feeling or goal. The use of mantras or visualization while falling asleep is again something that comes up frequently when people talk about lucid dreaming. Repeating something like, "I will remain aware. When I dream, I will know it is a dream. I will remain aware. When I dream, I will know it is a dream," is something that many people have found to be helpful when attempting to retain consciousness, or rather re-evoke consciousness during dreaming. However, focusing one's mantras or one's visualizations on that particular purpose is by no means our only option. The specific mantras we use while we fall asleep can set whatever sorts of goals we have, and these needn't remain static over time. So, for instance, if I'm interested in exploring the concept of transition and hidden spaces within dreams, I may repeat a mantra to that effect as I fall asleep. And the next morning when I wake and I recall the dreams I had that night, look for the symbology or events in that dream that reflect this concept. Then on the second night, I can incorporate visualization, the imagery of whatever it was in that dream that captured this idea, while either again repeating the same mantra or wrapping in the specific sort of example that I faced in that dream. So that over days and weeks, I walk myself down this winding dream path that explores the same sort of idea in different ways over time. In much the same way that we can engage in physical behaviors during ritual, particular emotions or actions that become associated with a certain thing, we can incorporate physical form into the process of falling asleep in order to try and tap into that same kind of connection. Now, obviously, engaging in motion itself is somewhat counterproductive to sleep and isn't an option at all while engaged in REM. But the conformation of your body, that is, the position you put yourself in while falling asleep, is something you can control, even if over the course of the night you naturally move out of that position. Most of us have a preferred habitual position we get in when we fall asleep. We may have a couple, and in time these particular positions facilitate falling asleep in much the same way any other sort of associative learning occurs. I know that when I curl on my left side with my left arm under my head, it's a prelude to going to bed. But one can expand one's sleeping position repertoire. And there is no compelling reason to believe that one can't create new topical associations between a particular position and a particular sleep-related exercise or a concept. A position that may initially feel unnatural, and frankly I would argue it's better if it initially feels somewhat unnatural, can come to represent the position that you fall asleep in when your intention is to engage in some form of ritualized sleeping. Now, the specific position itself can incorporate some kind of symbolic relevance, and this is something you can explore. But by altering the position in which you sleep, and even the orientation in which you sleep, which is to say, if your body is normally aligned with your head to the north and your feet to the south, sleeping east-west, or with your head in the south, which granted works better if you don't share your bed with a partner, can develop its own particular significance, which, when combined with other components, can effectively aid you in shaping the overall experience and dreams that you engage in while you sleep. And that's really what it comes down to, I think, this idea of layering components, combining techniques and approaches the same way that you would in ordinary ritual in order to turn the experience of falling asleep into something more. Now, on a related note to this idea of sleeping in different positions, I also think that modulating the level of comfort that you're in as you fall asleep may be something that you find useful. Now, you obviously don't want to be so uncomfortable that you can't possibly fall asleep. And there are people who have quite a bit of difficulty falling asleep as it is, and for whom this sort of thing might be counterproductive. But for those of us to whom sleep comes easily, doing something that slightly decreases our comfort can aid in eliciting a particular sort of state that we can carry over into sleep and which may then impinge upon our dreams. For instance, there are some people who hate feeling constricted while they sleep, and for whom that feeling elicits a sort of low-level dread. Well, if that's the case, it may be just what the doctor called for if what you'd like to do is explore topics like fear and anxiety. Similarly, the addition of objects or actions or sounds that induce a particular sort of emotional state immediately prior to going to bed can be employed to set the tone for that night, as can modulating the stiffness of the thing you're sleeping upon or changing the room you sleep in altogether. Now, once again, of course, this isn't always an option if one lives with other people who are going to be puzzled and somewhat disturbed to find you sleeping in the middle of the living room when they get up in the morning. But if you have free run of your house, this is certainly something you may want to try. At the end of the day, the creativity you can bring to the experience of falling asleep and engaging in sleeping is really no less than that which you can bring to any other sort of ritual, but we frequently fail to do so. For many of us, sleep is a necessary act that we just don't really think about that much, and we don't really seek to take as much advantage of it as we can, which I think is a giant missed opportunity, particularly given that the dream state is quite the mystical experience and one that is almost universal. It's a process we barely understand and which, despite its weirdness, is so commonplace that it's easy to lose sight of just how potent and wondrous an opportunity it is. What you get up to in your dreams is as much a part of your life and as potentially rich a source of memory and experience as the waking world. And so I think it's entirely reasonable for all of us to use any tricks we've got up our sleeves in order to make the most out of those experiences, regardless of whether that means using guided visualization as we fall asleep, holding particular ritual objects, stones, or tools in our hands while we fall asleep, or maintaining a collection of poster board-sized sigils that we can slip under our beds in an effort to shape the experiences we have while and when we drift off into that other world. Anyway, thank you to everybody who popped by, and I do hope some of what I've talked about today can help inspire. And until next time, sweet dreams.